Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine's bid to join the European Union has been given a major boost with a recommendation that it be granted candidate status. But the European Commission says the country must make reforms on rule of law, oligarchs, human rights, and tackling corruption. In her address, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who wore the blue and yellow colors of Ukraine, said Ukrainians were ready to die for the European dream, adding that Ukraine had the right to determine its own future. It comes after 4 European leaders traveled to Kyiv on Thursday and publicly supported Ukraine's admission to the bloc. The EU's 27 member states have to give the green light to grant Ukraine candidate status, with leaders set to discuss it at a summit next week. The same status has been given to Moldova, but not Georgia, another ex-Soviet republic.
Latest news, Ukraine. Headliner. Secretaries of Defense and State said publicly, the U.S. wants Ukraine to win and weaken Russia. Biden said tone it down. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken had taken off on separate flights from southeastern Poland after their risky high-stakes visit to Kyiv, when they were conferenced into a phone call from President Joe Biden. During their whirlwind April trip, Austin appeared to expand the U.S. goals in Ukraine, saying publicly that the administration wanted the Ukrainians to win the war against Russia, not just defend themselves, and that the U.S. hoped to weaken Russia to the extent that it could not launch another unprovoked invasion. Blinken had publicly aligned himself with the remarks. Now Biden wanted to discuss the mounting headlines that resulted. Biden thought the secretaries had gone too far, according to multiple administration officials familiar with the call on the previously unreported conference call, as Austin flew to Germany and Blinken to Washington. The president expressed concern that the comments could set unrealistic expectations and increase the risk of the United States getting into a direct conflict with Russia. He told them to tone it down, said the officials. Biden was not happy when Blinken and Austin talked about winning Ukraine. One of them said he was not happy with the rhetoric. The secretaries explained that Austin's comments had been misconstrued, another senior administration official said. But the displeasure Biden initially conveyed during the phone call, the officials also said, reflecting his administration's belief that despite Ukrainian forces' unexpected successes early on, the war would ultimately head in the direction it is now in 2 months later, a protracted conflict in which Russia continues to make small and steady advances. U.S. officials are increasingly concerned that the trajectory of the war in Ukraine is untenable and are quietly discussing whether President Volodymyr Zelensky should temper his hardline public position that no territory will ever be ceded to Russia as part of an agreement to end the war, according to 7 current U.S. officials, former U.S. officials, and public officials. Some officials want Zelensky to dial it back a little bit, as one of them put it, when it comes to telegraphing his red lines on ending the war. But the issue is fraught, given that Biden is adamant about the U.S. not pressuring the Ukrainians to take steps one way or another. His administration's position has always been that any decision about how and on what terms to end the war is for Ukraine to decide. Meanwhile, major British media outlets are providing one-sided coverage of the Ukrainian conflict and are wasting no efforts to clean the image of neo-Nazis in the country. Steve Sweeney, an international editor at the London newspaper The Morning Star, said in an interview with Russia outlet RT. He went on to say, you have the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, the BBC, Sky News, Channel 4, all really producing identical reports from Kyiv and Lviv that don't deviate at all from the government line, from the NATO line on what's happening. Sweeney, recently back from Ukraine, where he traveled to Lviv near the border with Poland, said he had to go for himself there because British media reporting on Ukraine is now incredibly restricted. Great effort is being made to really whitewash and rehabilitate the neo-Nazi Azov military battalion as either having no influence in Ukraine or being just simply misunderstood nationalists, Sweeney pointed out. The Azov battalion is an infamous neo-Nazi unit ascribed officially to the Ukrainian military. Its members have led the fight against Russian forces in the strategic port city of Mariupol since the start of Moscow's military operation. Many of them were killed, while the rest, including a number of commanders, laid down their arms earlier in May after holding strong surrounded at the Azov steel plant for weeks. Footage of the surrendering fighters reveal many of them sporting tattoos of swastikas and other Nazi symbols. Sweeney went as far as to describe the BBC's reporting on the Azov battalion as a masterclass in fascism denial. The Morning Star editor described what he saw in Lviv, saying the only city itself was essentially full of fascists and mercenaries and people in military fatigues that are using civilian transport networks to enter Ukraine from Poland. The foreigners in military gear who say they come to Ukraine to kill the Russians are welcomed with open arms. They rolled the red carpet out and they slapped on the back and treated as heroes, he said. That's the latest news, and now my thoughts. There's a major problem that is happening, and this is definitely a conflict that has taken on new visions. And when we see people like authoritarian nationalist Max Boot, who goes on Morning Joe this morning and talk about the war being not just a Ukrainian war. It is no longer a Ukrainian war. It's a war with the United States. Here he is on Morning Joe.
It's absolutely essential, and I think the key here is we have to understand that we're making a mistake in the way that we think about the war, because we keep thinking about it as their war. The Ukrainians are fighting. We need to think about it as our war. Putin is waging war on the West. He is trying to destroy the rules-based international order that we Americans, we Europeans, we all stand for this. This is a direct threat to all of us, and we need to understand this is not a foreign aid project. This is not charity. This is self-defense. This is the front line of freedom right here in the Donbass. The Ukrainians are fighting and dying for all of us. We need to step up. And to echo what Ed Luce was saying, it is unacceptable that right now the Ukrainians are being outgunned 10-1 in artillery, 10-1. They are losing over 100 soldiers a day. The United States has not seen those kinds of losses since World War II. The Ukrainians are willing to fight. They are willing to die. They are defending their land. They are standing up to one of the most evil dictators in the world, but they don't have the weapons they need to get the job done. They have just enough to prevent a Russian victory, but they don't have enough to defeat the Russians, to win for Ukraine. And that is unacceptable. All of us need to step up. The Europeans in particular, as Joe suggested, because they are doing less than we are. But we need to step up, too. We're not providing Gray Eagle drones that the Ukrainians need. We're not providing as many multiple launch rocket systems as they need. All of us collectively can be and should be doing more, because we need to understand this is our fight that the Ukrainians are on the front lines of.
And this is the problem when you have ultra conservatives, in which Max Boot has written a book, The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right. But that doesn't mean that he is no longer anymore an ardent neoconservative. Here he is advocating for the extended conflict of Ukraine. And not only just to extend the conflict, but to make it a U.S. position. I didn't know Russia was attacking the West. I thought they were fighting against the CIA-backed separatists, which comes at a cost of Ukrainian lives, in which the United States is most adamantly not opposed to, because if it is meaning to defeat the Russians, they'll do it to the last Ukrainian life, because that's who will suffer in all this. In 2003, Max Boot actually advocated for the war in Iraq, in which he later condemns, something that William Crystal had done himself, the infamous co-author of the Project for New American Century. And the fight is not based on the truth. And if you're getting your facts from the media, you're being misled intentionally. Not from those fawning puppets called reporters. They're not. Jeannie Pirro, Anderson Cooper, and all these people are basically mouthpieces for the state meant to divide the American public along political lines. These are millionaires and they don't care about the likes of the average middle and lower classes. Neither does Max Boot, and neither does anybody in the US federal government, which is the reason why they could spend billions of dollars to fund the Ukrainian war, but don't have enough money to spend on the American people. The most they could do is $600 during the COVID mandates. Last Wednesday, the Biden administration provided an additional $1 billion in military aid to Ukraine to fight against Russia. The Pentagon also provided 18 howitzers and 36,000 rounds of howitzer ammunition, along with 2 Harpoon coastal defense systems. And of course, who profits from this? Well, the obvious military contractors like LG3 Technologies, Boeing, Raytheon, and others. And that's why you have these retired 4-star generals go on Fox, go on CNN, and ply their wares like some prostitute on a London street to the average citizen for a price. Make sure that you advocate for conflict. As George Orwell once wrote in 1984, war was not meant to be won, it was meant to be continuous. And in this case, they're hoping they could drag this war out. But if this war does end, well, there's other countries we could talk about. In fact, Fox News, the whores that they are basically against the Ukraine conflict, but not so much against China or Iran. There are no winners here, ladies and gentlemen. The losers are the American people and those citizens who are caught in the crossfire of our ready-made missiles and bullets. The war is not won. And no matter who's in office, the war will be continuous.